As I'm sure quite a lot of you know, my favourite car of all time is the little Austin Mini, because they're brilliant. But by the time I was growing up, seeing a Mini had become a bit of an event because they're being supplanted by a new pretender. So today on Twin Cam, this is the R53 Mini Cooper S. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if right now there are quite a lot of people preparing a comment reading something along the lines of, "That's not a proper Mini." And to be fair, I would have to agree with you on that. But these are phenomenally successful cars, and for the past 21 years now have kept Rover's old Cowley factory going. So as these near cult classic status, they're worth a good objective overview. Now, this isn't going to be a video about the R50 Mini as a whole, just the Cooper S, the R53. But even with that in mind, there's still quite a bit of information that we could really do with in order for us to understand why and how the Cooper S exists in the way it does. So let's take just a small peek at the design and the development of the modern Mini as a whole. Now, as I'm sure we all know, the Mini's creators were BMC, or Austin and Morris, and through mergers and bankruptcies and nationalisations and privatisations and various new names, the company eventually became known as the Rover Group. In the 1990s, Rover had three marques: Rover, Land Rover and MG, and these had gradually become the group's only marques as names like Austin had been killed off. And through to 1987, the Mini was marketed as the Austin Mini. But after the name was killed, all former Austins became markless. The company was so big and the cars so well known that we were left with badges that just read Mini, Metro, Maestro and Montego. Now, the Metro would be heavily revised and it eventually became the Rover Metro, but the Mini, in the UK at least, never received official Rover badges. And as the Mini's profile as a fashion statement began to re-emerge, Rover gave the Mini proper badges of its own, based on the old Austin and Morris badges flanked by wings, and Mini became a marque all of its own. In 1994, BMW bought Rover from British Aerospace and in the process got their hands on Mini. Now, the idea of an all-new Mini had been bandied about for decades, and Rover themselves had replaced the Mini with the Metro in 1980, but kept building the original purely as a smaller, cheaper option. But with the Mini now in a renaissance, the idea of an all-new car that carried the badging, the styling and the character of the original became a necessity rather than an opportunity. But in the beginning, BMW and Rover had two very different ideas as to what a new Mini should look like. Rover wanted a car that was true to the original's philosophy, so it should be radically modern, looking like nothing else on the road and exploring new mechanical technologies. The concept they came up with was called the Spiritual, and it was indeed very sensible and very modern, but BMW hated it. The problem was that Rover was willing to sacrifice the Mini's shape for the sake of producing as best a car as they could. But BMW wanted style to be the centre of the new Mini. And as they were the ones with the reins, the car Rover and BMW created together was a tribute to the original. And I think this approach was absolutely on the money. If you're a regular viewer of my channel, you'll know how much I adore the Isagonis philosophy of ultimate packaging and groundbreaking engineering. But in the case of the Mini, it's the car's style and character that did the heavy lifting, not the brilliantly advanced mechanicals. So concentrating on the former was the key to a successful Mini revival. And the car we all received in 2001 was dreadfully impractical and not advanced really in any department. But it was recognisably a Mini. And it looked good, and it sounded good, and it drove with impeccable character. So that brings us over to this Cooper S, because without those design choices there's no doubt that we wouldn't have had a car anywhere near as chic as this. and we probably wouldn't have a standout hot hatch version at all. And even the badge on the back of this proves a point, because the original Mini Cooper S wasn't just a quick Mini, but was a proper homologation special, built for a purpose in rather small numbers. So even the badging of this car, the existence of a Cooper S, proves a point about what it needs to be. So with that sorted, let's see what makes the Cooper S tick. But before we do, a message from this video's sponsor. 3 years now I've been doing this video making lark, and the maddening thing about it all is my own change of perception in what I do. So at the beginning I was looking up towards people who were doing wonderful things with this platform, and it's the gift that some creators have in engaging and entertaining an audience, as well as videography itself, that I look to learn from. And 36 months on, there are people that are messaging me, asking for hints, tips and advice on doing a similar thing. And it's amazing that people find me semi-competent enough to ask as part of their own story towards indulging their inner nerd. But nobody knows everything. We're all sharing our knowledge and experience with others, enabling each other to expand our horizons and do something we love. So I've teamed up with Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of online classes and members across 150 countries. Everyone coming together to find inspiration, learn new skills and take the next step in their creative journey. For example, I've finally started exploring the art of photography, but outside of my professional settings, Skillshare offer courses across all kinds of fields, including drawing, something I've always wanted to dabble in. But now, thanks to Gabrielle Brickley's Learn to Draw, I'm on that journey, and you could be too, with whatever you have an interest in. But Skillshare isn't just about creating, but also building and thriving, finding your identity and growing. There are new classes launched every week, so there's always something new to discover. And to start your journey, simply follow the link in the description below, where only the first 1,000 people to join will be treated to a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. We've established that the existence of a Cooper S is an event in itself. So as a mainstream production model, Rover and BMW had to do something to bring intrigue to the car. And that's what we'll find teased by the big scoop in the bonnet and then below it. Because the S has a supercharger. The superior form of forced induction. And this is bolted to the back of one of the more controversial components of the modern Mini, because this engine is known as the Tritec and has a history all of its own. When the R50 was in development, it was expected that the car would use Rover's K-Series. And whatever way you look at it, even with the head gasket reputation, these are fantastic little engines. Very revvy, exceptionally light and rather powerful. And Rover had actually looked at installing it in the original Mini. But even when it came to the modern Mini, there were issues. The thing wouldn't physically fit, and BMW blamed Rover for not having a space-efficient package, which is a bit of a joke considering how impractical the rest of this car is, but the styling was set, Rover had to design around it, so the K-Series was out. The BMW management arranged for the development of an all-new engine between themselves and Chrysler, to be built in Brazil. Sounds convoluted, and it is. But the result is the engine that all petrol R50 Minis used. 4 cylinders, a single overhead cam, but still 16 valves, and in the UK, 1600cc. No matter whether it's the Mini one, Cooper or Cooper S, they're all 1600cc, with different tuning and the supercharger on the S. So the Root style Eaton blower bumps the power up from 113 in the Cooper to 163 brake horsepower. And in the facelifted car like this one, that's 170 horsepower at 6,000 RPM and 162 pound-feet of torque at 4,000 revs. Now, despite being such a controversial bit of the car's development and something that best case scenario should never have happened, I think that this engine in this form with the supercharger on it is a bit of a gem, because the power delivery is incredibly smooth. That's partly thanks to the supercharger, but it's grumbly in its own way, which makes it feel a little bit like a Mini. It's very smooth, unlike an A-Series, but it has that grumbliness of an A-Series, and the supercharger on top adds a whole nother dimension, and if we're really reaching, does hark back to the gearbox in sump setup from the A-Series and the straight cut first gear. So there is a bit of Mini character in here, even if it is manufactured rather than there by inherent design. Oh, this thing rockets! Whoa! That is very quick. And it sounds brilliant. Supercharger. This is why I think it's the better form of forced induction. Because first of all, there's absolutely no lag. You don't need special boost control to make it work. But, oh, the soundtrack is so good. Even from low revs. Oh, it's brilliant. And yet the engine, completely responsive, picks up from nothing. So flexible. My issue, actually, is the throttle response. Because all modern Minis had an electronic throttle pedal, which should be fine. But I can't help but feel it's a bit disconnected from proceedings. It does feel like you're having to shout a command down to the engine room, and then a couple of seconds later it picks up. But when it does pick up, it shoots. The engine is very responsive. It's just the throttle pedal I think could do with being a little bit tighter. I think it could do with a proper throttle cable rather than the electronic system. But still, it sounds brilliant. Now, the gearbox was another Rover BMW battleground, and in the Standard 1 and Cooper, the gearbox was Rover's R53, which should have been fine, and it was in many Rover products. But the Mini was a little bit powerful and a little bit heavy to use it properly, and so a lot of R65 gearboxes in Minis ended up failing. Not a good look. But in later cars, and in this Cooper S, is a Getrag gearbox, and the Cooper S has got a 6-speed one, which is lovely. But I don't think the gear change is very good. It's very notchy and a bit heavy, but not in a good way. Not as if you're really mechanically doing something, more as if you're having to put more effort than it's really worth into changing gear. I'm not all that impressed by it, but the ratios are nice and long, and the engine is more than powerful enough to use them. So despite long ratios, it still feels very responsive, and then on the motorway, it's very refined as well. But yeah, it's not an enjoyable gearbox to use, really. A bit disappointed in that. So it seems as though the powertrain is a bit hit and miss, because the engine feels like a gem. The supercharger, the power, the engine responsiveness and flexibility is brilliant. But it's allied to a gearbox that isn't that nice to use, and the throttle pedal that isn't all that connected. We're 75% of the way there. Overall, I still think it's very good. I'm very pleased with it. Now, for the suspension, there are a few more existential decisions to be made, because as with the K-Series, it was expected for a long time that the modern Mini would use hydrogas suspension. But with BMW holding the reins, the car very much became BMW-Specified, Rover-Designed. So with that came BMW-esque suspension of McPherson struts at the front and an evolution of the Z-axle at the back. And starting here at the front, on paper, struts are less impressive than the double wishbones and hydrogas that Rover may have ended up with. But the back is far more impressive than Rover would have made it. The question begins with the layout, because unlike any BMW, this is front-wheel drive. So the Z-axle in it, much like that in the Rover 75, is designed entirely by Rover in order to fit the needs of the car. So despite looking like a BMW, which is good for image, I'm assured that this is all Rover engineered and Rover set up, which is pretty amazing considering how convoluted and stressful the Mini's development was. But I have to say, the benefits show, because this car is incredibly nimble. It feels like it's got an even shorter wheelbase than it does. The punchiness of this engine attached to a chassis, it's so nimble. It just feels so point and shoot. It's a brilliant little thing to drive. It feels so direct, the steering, and realistically it shouldn't feel direct, because when the car was in development, Rover were planning on using electric power steering for this thing, but when they actually drove it, they thought it wasn't good enough. So very hastily they knocked up an electro-hydraulic system based on that in the Rover 25. And yeah, you can feel it, because this power steering feels really direct and quite communicative as well, considering. And the electro-hydraulic steering is actually a feature of these Minis, because you might have heard one of these in a car park squealing and hissing away. And that's the electric pump, and it was designed to do that. It was designed to do that, to give it a little bit of character, because why not? If you can make a car make a cute squealing noise, then why not? And the engineers at Rover and BMW thought that was a good idea. And the rack feels very nicely geared as well, so I'm not doing too much arm twirling. It feels so well designed. It just feels right. So intuitive. Not overly light. There's a bit of weight to everything. That's the thing about these cars, is that the original Mini was a very light car to drive, to be honest. But in this, there's a bit of weight in the steering. It's nowhere near as light as they could have made it. And all the pedals have a bit of weight in them too, so the clutch pedal especially really does have a bit of weight behind it. And that's unlike any other small car from this era, because everything was just designed to be light. And though the original Mini was very light as well, this has all that added force into it to make it feel beefier, to make it feel like more of a driver's car. So they haven't just gone down the avenue of trying to make it feel like an original and try and instill a false character in it. Instead, what they've done is made it feel like a driving machine, to make it feel like a really, really gently but brilliantly engineered performance car. Then there are the looks. It's brilliant. Thanks to BMW bringing Frank Stephenson in to mastermind it, any R50 is the best looking small car of this era, bar none. And it achieves a clear retro style in a timeless fashion, much like the 75 that also came out of Rover in the same era. But unlike the new Beetle and Jaguar S-Type, both of which have aged badly. But it turns out that Frank Stephenson had form for doing this, as a few years after the Mini, he worked on the new Fiat 500, which still looks as fresh today as it did 15 years ago. Now, try and ignore the stickers. This car belongs to a friend of mine, and he hasn't had it long. He didn't tell me, and I didn't expect to see them when I rocked up to his house. So blame the previous owner. But back to the Mini, and this stance is perfection. Taking everything it needs to from the original, while adding a bulldog attitude to it all. The original could appear charming and cute, but the modern Mini added a bit more height, more curviness and an underbite, all of which gives it a sportier character. And the modifications made to the 53 only enhanced that, with the larger rear spoiler, deeper bumpers, twin central exhausts, bigger wheels, chromed fuel filler and the scoop in the bonnet for the intercooler. I remember at the time wondering whether I thought it was all too much, but with hindsight it's very well judged. There's enough here to separate it without it becoming fussy or garish. The twin exhausts and additional grills really enhance the rear end, and the scoop has become an integral part of the Cooper S image. But I do still think the wheels are just a bit too big. But if the exterior is perfection, then I'm lost for words with the interior. Because it's incomprehensible that they designed such a cool and timeless cabin. Every single touch in here harks back to the best of the original, emphasising it a bit but not so much as to make it a caricature, like the modern ones are. So we have a big central speedometer, open door bins, a switch panel, and even the blinking light on the end of the stalk is replicated, even if this is for the alarm rather than for the indicators. But there are additions here as well that never officially found their way onto a classic Mini, like the rev counter mounted on top of the steering column, like the ones everyone added to their original Minis in period. Despite this being a very mainstream small car, it feels special. And despite zero practicality and despite some cheap feeling plastics, this thing feels designed with genuine love and passion for the original. And to be honest, that's how the chassis feels too. Because this doesn't feel just like a very good, competent small car. It feels absolutely full of life. It's startling just how good this is. When I first got in this car this morning, I was ready to be disappointed by it. Not because I thought it would be bad, because I thought it would be brilliant. I got in it and it just felt very normal. It felt very controlled and it felt quite quiet and a little bit dull. But when you really open the taps, let the supercharger sing, and when you really have the confidence to be able to throw it into bends, it really comes to life. And that shows that it's the best of both worlds, because it can be very balanced, very controlled, and feel like a much bigger car than it actually is. It feels refined, but then when you throw it into corners, it does have the ability. It feels like a little racing car. I love it. I really love it. The more I drive this car, the more I'm becoming accustomed to it, and I'm learning to trust it because it is so capable. This is the most capable small car I've ever driven. I drove a Hyundai i30N a few weeks ago, which is a car in the class above that's 15 years newer in design, and this feels more confidence inspiring, more alive, more capable in every way. This is such a fun car to drive. See, it has that little bit of kind of Tiggerness that I like to call it about the original Mini to it, that when you really start trying to bounce it off bumps and start throwing it into corners, it starts to hop a little bit like the original did, but not in an uncontrolled manner, in a brilliantly controlled way. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of this. Big fan of this. When I got in this car, I half expected to not be wowed by it, but just to understand where people were coming from, and to see, yeah, this is a brilliant, slightly characterful, fun little car, but I didn't expect to be wowed by it. I didn't expect to be wowed by it because a few months ago I drove an Alfa Sud, which I expected to be wowed by, and I wasn't. The Alfa Sud's a very capable little car, but that's all it feels. It just felt capable. Great sounding engine, great throttle response, and very delicate controls, but didn't feel characterful at all. It just felt like a competent car. This feels like it's got loads of character. This I'm enjoying much more than the Alfa Sud. Oh, it feels like a friend already, this car. It really does. It feels like a really eager little puppy. so much fun. Oh, mini friend, R50 friend, not an S, but an R50 friend. Yeah, this is, yeah. There's no wonder that these are going to rocket in value. I have no doubt that these are going to rocket in value. Rocket. Because this is incredible fun. Absolutely incredible fun. What a car. What a car. And this car actually makes me feel a bit sad. Because this is ace. This is absolutely everything I would have expected a modern Mini to be. It's got character in all the right places, but it's a premium product. It's refined, and though it has no practicality and very little engineering prowess, it does 50% of the Mini job, and that's just right. I think that's perfect for a tribute to the original. And compare that to the modern ones. They pale in comparison, because this is so chic. It's such a good looking car. It's so carefully designed as a tribute to the original, but the modern ones are just behemoths that don't look very good. In fact, they're horrendously ugly, and the interiors aren't very nice, and they feel even more cramped than this car does. I don't get the new ones. They make no sense as either a Mini tribute or a fashion statement, because they're neither. This feels like everything I'd want a modern Mini to be. It's brilliant. And I just wish that BMW could go back to cattle grid, to building Minis like this, because this is so good. And on that note, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And we'll have more videos coming along soon.